In Montana, it was often said that the land remembered everything. Every step taken across it, every loss carried in silence, every promise a person made to themselves and failed to keep. Ethan McCall knew this better than most. He stood at the edge of his property in the early morning of 1889, watching the wind bend the dry grass as if testing its strength. The ground beneath his boots was the same as it had been 7 years earlier. He was not. The house behind him held no warmth and no accusation, only the quiet absence of those who had not lived to see his return. Ethan had not come back seeking hope. He returned because there was nowhere left to run. Some debts did not fade with distance, no matter how far a man traveled to escape them. That same day, a woman rode north toward Madison County, unaware that her name would soon become part of this land's memory. Emma Rowley did not believe in fate, nor did she wait for miracles. She trusted numbers, contracts, and the strength of her own hands. Everything she owned fit into a single traveling trunk and a lifelong habit of not attaching herself to people or places. When their paths crossed, it would not feel like rescue. No hand would be offered first. No promise would be made that things would grow easier. There would be only land that did not forgive weakness, and two people too stubborn to risk losing everything again. Sometimes this is how a story begins, not with hope, but with return, with the quiet decision to face the place where everything once went wrong. If this beginning spoke to you, you are welcome to stay with us. By subscribing to the channel, you become part of Dust and Devotion Tales, where more slow, cinematic frontier stories are waiting to unfold.
The land greeted Ethan McCall without ceremony. It lay spread beneath a pale Montana sky, dry and stubborn, marked by years of neglect and older scars that no season had softened. The ranch at the foot of the Beaverhead Mountains waited in the same state he had left it, only quieter. Fences sagged where posts had rotted. The barn leaned slightly east, as if tired of standing upright. The house carried the hollow weight of rooms no longer lived in, dust settling where voices once lingered. Ethan moved through it all with measured steps. 7 years had passed since he had last stood there. 7 years since war and loss had reshaped him into someone the land barely recognized. The soil was thinner now, worked too hard and given too little. It mirrored what remained inside him. What should have felt like inheritance felt instead like a reckoning. This place held his family's name, but it also held every reason he had fled without looking back. In Madison County, people remembered him as a man who kept to himself, a veteran who returned changed, a son who buried his dead and vanished. His return stirred no welcome, only quiet observation. In a place like this, survival left little room for sentiment. At nearly the same time, Emma Rowley arrived from the South, her journey marked by practicality rather than longing. She carried widowhood without display and debt without complaint. Her purpose was clear. She was there to restore order where neglect had taken root, to bring numbers and structure to farms that teetered on the edge of collapse. She approached the county with caution, knowing how easily a woman without protection could be measured and misjudged. Their first encounter was brief and restrained, shaped by circumstance rather than intention. It passed without warmth, yet neither dismissed it as meaningless. There was recognition in the distance they kept, an awareness that each carried weight the other could sense but not yet name. The land bore witness to it all. It demanded endurance, punished weakness, and offered nothing freely. Those who remained learned to bend without breaking, or they were driven out. Both Ethan and Emma understood this truth before either of them fully understood the other.
Emma arrived at the McCall Ranch with measured steps, her luggage strapped to the back of a slow-moving wagon. She treated the job as just another contract, a temporary assignment, where her skills could be applied and then left behind without attachment. The ranch was far from orderly. Fences sagged under months of neglect, barns leaned at odd angles, and supplies were scattered as though the property itself had grown weary of being tended. Papers and accounts were unfinished,
half-burned receipts mingling with dust and sawdust. Every task required her attention. Every corner demanded assessment and care. Ethan moved through the land with a quiet intensity, inspecting buildings, cattle, and fields, doing what he had always done, taking responsibility alone. He observed Emma from a distance, noting her diligence and precision, but he did not offer help, nor did he ask for it. His past had taught him that trust was earned slowly, and independence had become the armor he wore against disappointment. He allowed her presence, but kept his distance, creating invisible boundaries neither had yet crossed. As Emma settled into her routine, fragments of her own history surfaced with each challenge. The loss of her husband had left her raw, and the subsequent legal battles over inheritance and debts had forced her to learn self-reliance in ways she had never imagined. She had grown accustomed to standing alone, and though the ranch offered a chance at steady work, it also reminded her how vulnerable she had been and how fiercely she now defended her autonomy. Outside the ranch, the small county murmured with curiosity. Rumors spread of the widow who had taken residence at the property of a man known for solitude and reticence. Some whispers were admiring, others tinged with suspicion, but all carried the weight of scrutiny. Emma felt the tension of eyes watching from every corner of town, a subtle pressure that pressed against her independence as sharply as the Montana wind pressed against the prairie. Despite the proximity of their work, Ethan and Emma maintained a careful distance, each aware of the other, yet restrained by habit and unspoken rules. Their interactions were professional, deliberate, and cautious. Small acts of recognition, a shared glance across the yard, the passing of tools, the unspoken acknowledgement of effort, hinted at mutual respect, but nothing more. Both carried the burden of their pasts, and both hesitated to allow reliance or vulnerability to enter the space between them. The first tension came not in words, but in actions. A collapsed fence threatened the livestock, and Emma moved to repair it, following protocols Ethan had ignored for weeks. He observed, silent and watchful, not from judgment, but from instinct. Their methods clashed. She insisted on structure, schedules, and careful planning, while he relied on experience, intuition, and muscle memory. The land itself became a mirror of their inner struggle, showing that efficiency and instinct, control and surrender could not always coexist easily. By the day's end, both were exhausted, the sun dipping behind the mountains casting long shadows across the property. They recognized in each other a reflection of their own persistence and isolation, yet also the limits of their endurance. The conflict had not erupted into confrontation, but it lingered in the tension between the habits they had honed over years of survival. For the first time since arriving, both felt the weight of boundaries between past and present, independence and cooperation, fear and possibility, pressing against them in the quiet of the evening. The relentless drought pressed down on the McCall ranch, the sun burning every blade of grass until it snapped underfoot. Cattle weakened and fell, their low moans drifting across the empty fields like a warning. Ethan rode slowly along the dry fence lines, feeling the weight of every loss in the sag of the boards and the emptiness of the water troughs. A letter from a large company offered him a chance to sell the land at a price far below its worth, a chance to walk away from years of struggle, from memories that clung like stubborn shadows. For the first time in years, he felt the temptation of surrender, the pull of ease against the stubborn call of responsibility. Emma moved among the buildings, counting every ruin and planning every repair, aware of the fragile thread of her own future tied to the ranch's survival. She had lived too long under the decisions of others, too often finding her stability stripped away, and she felt the echo of that fear in the possibility of the ranch falling into someone else's hands. Every gesture of care, every act of work, became a quiet protest against the idea that their lives could be claimed or discarded by a single signature on a contract. Between them, a connection deepened, unspoken but palpable, rooted in shared labor and the understanding of what was at stake. Ethan's gaze lingered on the steady rhythm of her hands, the calm certainty in her movements, while she noted the tension and determination that guided his own. No words passed, no confessions were made. Yet the weight of the ranch, the drought, and the choices ahead pressed equally on both of them. By the end of the week, the land seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Ethan to decide. The drought had not eased, the cattle continued to falter, and the offer from the company sat heavy in his thoughts. Selling would be a relief, but it would also mean betrayal, not only of the land, but of the promise he had once made to protect it. He realized that every small action, every fence mended, every barrel of water hauled, was part of the silent deliberation, part of the rehearsal for a choice that neither of them yet had the courage to voice aloud. The future of the ranch, and of the fragile bond forming between them, hung in that quiet space between hesitation and resolve, waiting for a moment neither was ready to claim.
Smoke curled into the sky before dawn, thick and acrid, carrying the scent of charred wood and lost effort. Ethan McCall rode hard across the ranch, heart hammering, as flames licked at the edges of the barn and storage sheds. The animals were restless, terrified, and he could do little but corral them into open pastures, watching helplessly as decades of work went up in fire. The heat burned his skin even from a distance, and the roar of the flames drowned out every rational thought. By the time the fire burned itself down to embers, half the outbuildings were gone, and supplies that had taken years to gather were reduced to blackened ruin. Tools, feed, and carefully stacked materials lay scattered among ash and splintered wood. The smoke of smoke hung in every corner, suffocating and inescapable, a tangible reminder of vulnerability and loss. Investigation suggested the fire was no accident, and the thought of deliberate harm only deepened the weight on Ethan's shoulders. Ethan stood amid the wreckage, silent, chest tight with self-reproach. He had failed to protect the ranch, to safeguard what he had promised to preserve. Every corner of the property seemed smaller now, diminished by what fire and carelessness had taken. For the first time in years, he felt the cold certainty of helplessness, an unsteady pulse of doubt and fear that made his usual stoicism crumble. Emma moved among the ashes with a quiet determination, cataloging what remained and planning immediate repairs. Her own hands shook from the heat and exertion, but she acted decisively, taking initiative where Ethan could not. She organized temporary shelters for the animals, salvaged tools where possible, and set priorities for rebuilding. Each motion was a refusal to surrender, a deliberate attempt to restore structure amid chaos. The roles they had relied on shifted subtly but unmistakably. Ethan, accustomed to control and decision, faltered, while Emma stepped into responsibility with a mix of pragmatism and urgency. The connection between them deepened silently, built on shared vulnerability, mutual reliance, and the acute awareness of how quickly what they depended upon could vanish. Fear of loss, of being unable to protect what mattered most, bound them together, though neither admitted it aloud. As night fell, the ranch smoldered quietly, shadows stretching over charred earth and collapsed structures. Both felt the weight of the day's destruction in different ways, Ethan in guilt and paralysis, Emma in the relentless drive to rebuild. Each confronted the fragility of their existence on the land, and the stark reality that even steady hands and careful planning could not fully prevent disaster. And in that darkness, both recognized the fragility of hope, the peril of attachment, and the courage required to rise from loss again.
The first light of morning fell softly over the scorched land, casting long shadows across the half-rebuilt fences and smoldering earth. Ethan McCall moved through the ranch with steady, deliberate steps, measuring, repairing, and rebuilding where the fire had left nothing. Each nail driven, each plank lifted, was an act of reclamation, a quiet assertion that the land and he would endure. The silence between tasks was not empty, but filled with unspoken understanding, the rhythm of work binding him to the place and to Emma in a new, subtle way. Emma rose early, her hands already roughened by weeks of labor, cataloging supplies, preparing feed, and tending to the animals with unwavering attention. She stayed despite the chance to leave, choosing instead the slow persistence of rebuilding over the easier path of escape. Her presence became a constant undercurrent to Ethan's methodical work, a steady force that neither sought to dominate nor be dominated, simply to exist alongside the other in purpose. Days blended into one another, filled with mundane chores and quiet moments of reflection. Repairs progressed in fits and starts, but each small victory, a repaired fence, a stocked trough, a barn wall stabilized, felt monumental. The land responded to the care, grass slowly pushing through scorched soil, animals regaining their strength, the air carrying the faint scent of renewal. Ethan began to let Emma's assistance ease the burden, no longer seeing help as a concession, but as collaboration, a shared effort that reinforced rather than diminished him. The trust between them solidified in the daily repetition of labor, a partnership unspoken but undeniable. They worked side by side, bodies and minds aligned to the slow, patient task of bringing life back to the ranch. The county's whispers faded, replaced by recognition of resilience and steadfastness. Neighbors who had once looked on with curiosity now offered quiet nods of respect, acknowledging the tenacity required to stand firm when the world threatened to take everything. The land beneath their feet began to feel solid again, each step a reclamation of the ground they had lost. In the stillness of late afternoons, when work paused and the horizon glowed in muted gold, both felt the subtle shift within themselves. The land healed, and in its slow restoration, a fragile but persistent sense of trust and steadiness took root between them. Each act of repair became an affirmation that loss did not have to define them, and that together they could endure the unpredictable rhythms of the earth and life upon it. The second offer arrived folded with care, carried by a rider who did not linger. Ethan held the paper longer this time, feeling its weight settle deeper than before. The land around him moved through its quiet routines, fences creaking softly in the wind, cattle shifting across the pasture. Once, such an offer would have felt like relief, an exit made respectable by ink and signatures. Now it felt different. The ranch no longer stood apart from him as a burden to endure or abandon. It had become something shaped by effort, loss, and the steady presence of another will beside his own. Emma understood the meaning of the letter without reading it. She stood at the edge of the field, hands busy with the work of preparation, her thoughts anchored in the soil beneath her boots. The choice before her was not new, but it had grown heavier. She could leave when the season turned, return to the careful distance of contracts and ledgers, to places that required her skills but not her staying. Or she could remain where her labor had begun to matter in ways that reached beyond balance sheets and schedules. Staying no longer felt like surrender, it felt deliberate. Their days moved forward without ceremony. They worked through the slow tasks that defined survival on the land, repairing what time and hardship had worn thin, preparing for winter with the patience learned through failure. Decisions once carried alone now unfolded through shared consideration, not spoken aloud, but understood through rhythm and habit. The ranch responded in small ways, grass holding where it once failed, animals steadying after months of strain. It was not recovery, not yet, but it was continuity. Ethan recognized that the land no longer asked only for endurance, it asked for commitment. The promise he had once made in isolation now carried the shape of a future that did not rely solely on his strength. Emma, too, felt the shift. Her independence remained intact, but it had softened at the edges, making room for something built rather than defended. The bond between them had not erased their pasts, but it had changed how those pasts guided their steps. When the decision settled, it did so quietly. No declaration marked the moment. The offer remained unanswered, and the days continued as they had, measured by work and weather. The land stayed in their care, not as a reminder of what had been lost, but as proof of what could still be built. The ranch no longer belonged to memory alone. It belonged to the present and to the work that would follow. Evening came gently, the prairie stretching wide beneath a cooling sky. They moved toward the house together, side by side, carrying with them the balance they had earned. The land held steady beneath their feet, offering no guarantees, only the chance to continue. And that was enough. If this quiet ending resonated with you, and you find yourself drawn to stories of endurance, choice, and hard-won hope, you are welcome to join us by subscribing to the channel. More journeys like this await you at Dust and Devotion Tales.